star of the show, we have Jennifer Pyrz with us today. Jennifer is the Chief Development Officer and Vice President for Infrastructure, Strategy, and Innovation at IndyGo, where she is responsible for the agency's strategic planning, engineering, and construction initiatives. Jennifer has more than 20 years of experience in the transportation industry, the vast majority as an engineering consultant. On the private side, Jennifer was responsible for managing and providing technical assistance and analysis for a diverse range of projects, including environmental studies, traffic forecasting, transit analyses, transportation plans, BRT construction, and architecture. In April 2020, Jennifer took the leap to the public side and is currently enjoying the opportunity to work on all transit all the time. Jennifer received master's and bachelor's degrees in civil engineering from Purdue University in 1995 and 1997, respectively, and Dr. Kumara Sinha was her thesis advisor. She met her husband on the Purdue Engineering Student Council, and Jennifer is currently on the advisory board for Women in Transportation Seminar of Greater Indianapolis and is a past president of Indiana ITE. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jennifer, and she can go ahead and do a wonderful presentation for us.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right, let me get myself shared here. All right, you guys see my intro slide? All right.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I've got like 3 screens going here. I want to make sure I can see your faces in case anybody starts, like in case you stop hearing me or something. Okay, got everything arranged. So I was given free reign to talk about kind of whatever I wanted to talk about, and Ariana and Abdullah and I talked a little bit about some possibilities of things you might be interested in. I settled on kind of telling you our story of how we came to be building bus rapid transit in Indianapolis. So I hope you'll be interested in kind of the history of it and the life cycle of the project, and very happy to dig into details in the Q&A as I move along. So I thought I'd start out, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit Indianapolis, I thought it'd be good to start out with a little context and share some facts about the city that then influence how we provide transit here. So we're the nation's 17th largest city when measured by population. We have about 860,000 residents. We have a consolidated city-county government. We've had this since 1970. When Indiana's code made us into what's called Unigov. So what that does is many of the functions of the city and county governments become consolidated. Some remain separate, but our city borders are generally the same as our county borders. What this results in is a large area for the city and a low population density, because we have kind of the high density downtown Indianapolis, Central Business District, and then what were once upon a time suburbs are still now part of our city. So we have a population density of a little over 2,000 people per square mile. That's about 30% of Minneapolis's density, if you've ever been to Minneapolis. We're about 60% of Dallas's density, and we're about 20% of what Chicago's population density is. So the density of our city and the population is one of the things that really has created challenges for us providing, especially higher speed transit. So beyond the local fixed route service, which has its own challenges, providing rapid transit is especially complicated by that. At the same time that we have low population density, we also have the 3rd highest combined cost of housing and transportation in the country, which means that despite the challenges in serving all of our people, we really do need those public transportation options. So IndyGo. Now, subsidized public transportation began in 1973 in Indianapolis, when the stockholders of the Indianapolis transit system voted to go out of business. And the city of Indianapolis bought the private company, Indianapolis Transit System, and took over all of their debts. The city, now having taken over the system and taken over the debts, dubbed the bus system Metro, and in 1996 we renamed ourselves to IndyGo. Until very recently, like maybe starting out back in that history of when our debts were acquired, it took a long time for us to get out of that. Up until really recently, we've struggled to have adequate funding to provide the level of service that we want to. Our revenue to operate and build came from a small share of local property taxes, a distribution of state sales tax revenue, which is called the Public Mass Transit Fund, federal grants, and then the fare box. We cover approximately 400 square miles with that money. With only a few minor exceptions, we only operate within the boundaries of the city and county. Remember that the city and county being the same thing. So struggling to have enough money in the early 1990s into the 2000s, we faced some very significant service cuts. And that's when our private and civic leaders really began to examine IndyGo and the value of public transportation in the city. So how did we go from that, those significant service cuts, to where we're at to now with some very significant expansion? Well, it was a long road. It involves significant effort from all across the city. And well before planners and engineers could even begin to get involved in designing and building the service, which is where I'm lucky to be right now, we first needed that dependable funding source that was commensurate with what our need really was. And the backing of the community was the biggest part of getting to that spot. So that effort started in earnest in about 2007, when the Greater Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce identified that the state of our public transportation system was putting us at a competitive disadvantage when it came to job retention and attraction. So they worked with their membership to educate and advocate on this position. They went to the legislature to share information, and then they supported the creation of the CITTF, which is the Central Indiana Transit Task Force. Their mission was to develop and present the private sector's preferred regional transportation strategy. In 2008, as part of the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce's Leadership Exchange, about 60 Indianapolis area business and civic leaders visited Denver to see their transit system in action and learn from their community leaders about their story and their lessons learned. And that trip really was the jumping off point for many of our Indianapolis leaders to really see what transit could be and how it could impact the community. And everything kind of started to gel together for making similar improvements in Indianapolis. So after that, next step then was to frame the vision, not just specifically what we wanted to build, but how we were going to connect and serve our community needs. And so that CITTF group was the one that did the planning effort to identify what it was that we were going to try to sell to the community. Early on, there was a really heavy emphasis on building a single corridor from the city center to the suburbs, really focused on rail. But as they dug into it, it became really apparent that that wasn't financially feasible, it wasn't politically feasible, and it really wasn't solving the problems that needed to be solved. So from there, the plan morphed into a regional vision for transit that had a much more holistic approach. It eventually took shape as part of the regional Indy Connect initiative. It had an enormous public outreach and education campaign. I hear it was the largest Indianapolis campaign ever done. In the entire region, tens of thousands of comments, hundreds of public meetings over 7 year period. And the public generally, like, the feedback that we got was just do it, start moving forward. So once we had consensus around the desire for transit, the plan as we wanted to build it, the next hurdle then was to identify a funding source. And that meant, in our case, asking the legislature to grant us the ability to tax ourselves. So to move forward, we first required legislative action at the state level, and we had to get a question on the ballot that the city council had to approve that would ask voters to pass a 0.25% income tax that would be dedicated to transit improvement. So that referendum was part of the 2018 election, and it passed with 59% of Marion County residents voting in support. It then went back to the City Council to be ratified, and we started collecting those taxes in 2019. The Marion County Transit Plan is the Indianapolis portion of that regional vision. It remains the framework for our current work, almost exactly. And as we, even several years later, we're enhancing and expanding our service offerings according to this plan. The network was designed to explicitly reach a higher percentage of those who do not have access to frequent transit, and to dramatically increase the number of people and jobs that are accessible within a 45-minute transit ride. In our new system, every route runs every day, and we're transitioning from a hub and spoke network to a grid network so that we can provide faster, more convenient transfers and reduce travel time on many of our routes. Bus Rapid Transit, or BRT, is the cornerstone of the transit plan, and it sets up the frequent spines of our overall system. So we've got the blue line, which runs east-west through the center of downtown. We've got the red line, which runs north-south through the center of town. And then the purple line, which follows the red line here and then goes out to the east and the northeast corner. Our BRT lines are intended to provide longer service hours, more frequent service, and thereby shorter transfer and wait times. We've also committed to an all-electric BRT fleet and to greening the rest of our fleet as much as we can. So these are the three lines. I just mentioned them. I've got them here in order of how we are constructing them. The red line is open now. It's 13 miles in phase 1. The total red line, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, total red line is actually about 35 miles, but its construction cost was $96.3 million. The purple line is actually we just completed design and hopefully we'll be starting construction late this summer, early fall. Total project cost is $170 million. And then the blue line will be our third line. We're at about 30% design with that one, starting construction in probably 2023, late 2023. It will be 24 miles and has a total project budget of $220 million. So we know where we want the BRT lines to run. We have the funding in place. We have the vision for the full network build out. How was it we decided to start with the red line? I get that a lot. A lot of people think that maybe going to the airport should have been the first one, but it really came down to data. We were very data driven. We were community focused. And the real reason that we started with the red line first is right here. Although the red line corridor covers only about 1% of our total service area, so the area within the county, it only covers about 1% of that. It has 15% of our boardings. It's the most population and employment dense area in the city. We found that we could reach more than 50,000 people and 150,000 jobs. And so, and on top of that, meet our equity and environmental justice objectives as well. So decided to move forward with the red line. It was originally called the North-South Corridor. It also, another benefit of it, it connected some of our biggest employers and institutions. The groups that backed us during the referendum that, came to Indianapolis wanting to increase their job retention, attract excellent employees. And so we're super supportive of transit. Studies have found that transit access is a significant factor in determining average rates of labor participation in cities. So as you may recall, the original impetus for expanding transit in Indy was to connect people to economic opportunity or jobs. So this really stood out to us as a good first step. So that north-south corridor through downtown really began to take shape. It provides connections to IU Health, the State House, the Government Center, Eli Lilly, Salesforce, Ivy Tech, University of Indianapolis. So once we had that identified, the next step then was to start adding the details, start finally like 5 years into all of this, and we're starting to get the engineers involved. So in about 2013, the Indianapolis Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO, took on responsibility for preparing an alternatives analysis in partnership with IndyGo and the Central Indiana Regional Transportation Authority. The purpose of the AA was to define the locally preferred alternative by selecting the Red Line's desired route, station location, service characteristics, etc. The LPA definition then would be transferred to IndyGo for the next step in that flow chart, which is project development. The MPO's involvement was especially important at this time because the conversation was regional, with the Red Line going outside of the city of Indianapolis to connect to Greenwood, Carmel, and Westfield. And since we're constrained within city boundaries, we really needed the MPO to help us with those regional conversations and identify the routing outside of our borders. So they led the conversations and the planning effort that was required to build that consensus around the locally preferred alternative. And so we started digging into quantitative and qualitative analysis of all the alternatives within that corridor and took one more step forward. So the alternatives analysis process includes assessing and narrowing the alternatives in 2 phases with increasing detail added to each phase. So along the way, we had many conversations with the public, stakeholders, and community leaders to get their input, seek feedback, and share progress. It was about a 1-year process to get from the start of this flowchart to the end. And as with any good planning study, the process started with a really detailed review of existing and future conditions, and then defined the alternatives and the recommended alternative eventually through the lens of what the alternative, which alternative should be considered, and called the evaluation methodology. So in evaluating the alternatives, we considered some high-level goals that had much more detailed objectives within them. And they all tied back to our original vision, the plans that communities had prepared, the objectives that all of the communities had. We did not create that vision for community planning ourselves. We pulled very heavily from what was already out there so that we knew what their values were and their vision. So effectiveness, that's the extent to which the alternatives address the stated needs in the corridor. Impacts is the extent to which the alternatives support other local policy goals, present potential environmental and traffic issues that could be fatal flaws or otherwise influence the selection of the alternative. The cost effectiveness, pretty self-explanatory. We look at both capital and operating costs and look at the extent to which those costs are commensurate with their anticipated benefits. There's the financial and technical feasibility, so the extent to which funding for the construction and operation of each alternative is considered to be available. Is the money readily available, and are there any potential engineering challenges or restrictions that could limit our ability to achieve that alternative? And then equity is the extent to which the alternatives costs and benefits are distributed fairly across different population groups. So we took many different alignments, and this clip here shows just on the north half of the line, the red lines are all of the different alignments we examined. And this is showing the poverty population within different census tracts around that line. So that was one of the evaluation measures we used, and we looked at how each alternative served the population, low-income population. So assessing the alignments against every one of those evaluation criteria allowed us to narrow the preferred route. We looked at calculations of transit-oriented development potential. We did preliminary cost estimates. We reviewed environmental features and constraints. We identified station locations, identified service characteristics and running rate way treatments, all as steps in how we defined this. And the resulting alternatives analysis then brought us to our final recommended alternative, or locally preferred alternative, which was then formally adopted by the Indianapolis MPO's board. So I mentioned that that the red line is really about 35 miles long. We decided early on, in part because of the challenges of funding and operating a system across jurisdictional boundaries, that we would implement the red line in 3 different phases. So the first phase, which is the one that's shown here and has been built and is operating, extends from the University of Indianapolis on the south side to Broad Ripple on the north side. It keeps the red line all within Marion County, which as I mentioned, is our current operating area. We have 28 stations. There are 34 actual platforms because some of the station areas have curbside. Many of them are center stations. 60% of the route is dedicated lanes. And we funded the $96.3 million project cost. We funded 80% of that with FTA small starts capital investment grant funds. Phases 2 and 3 will be constructed once those communities on the north and south of Indy pass their own referendum to fund the capital and operating costs that extend beyond the borders. We have completed environmental documentation for the whole route, but we've only done engineering here on this phase 1 section. So with planning complete, we were able to move on to design and NEPA. This is called project development and is a formal step in the FTA's small starts process. Once we meet certain criteria, FTA approves us to enter officially into project development. For any of you who maybe aren't familiar with NEPA, anytime we use federal funding, we're required to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. And it requires that we assess a project for its environmental impacts. So we look at air quality, congestion, historic impacts, water, environmental justice, etc. And the engineering then progresses alongside the NEPA documentation and they inform each other along the way. We also, in this step of project development, conduct outreach. We have third-party agreements that we have to prepare with like, for instance, Indianapolis Department of Public Works or a Citizens Energy Group who has a lot of utilities in the corridor. And then we coordinate with Federal Transit Administration consistently throughout. We meet with them at least once a quarter to share our progress, answer questions, get feedback. And then once a year, we have to submit a ratings package to the Federal Transit Administration so that they can score our project and track us through that small starts funding program. So a couple words, I brought up small starts a couple times. All 3 of our BRT lines are part of FTA's capital investment grant program. That program, the CIG program, provides more than $2 billion a year for rail, streetcar, and BRT projects. And then within that CIG program, we specifically are part of the small starts program. So small starts is used for projects that are less than $300 million in total project cost and are requesting less than $100 million in federal funding. So all 3 of our lines meet those criteria. And so we continue through the small starts program. In order to get into the small starts program and stay in the small starts program, every project has to be rated and scored by the FTA, and then certain criteria have to be met throughout the project's development. And we sign a grant with FTA once design is done and we're ready to initiate construction. It has requirements and restrictions that, make sure that FTA's money is being well spent. So FTA rates our projects based on kind of 2 overarching criteria. There's the project justification criteria, and then there's the local financial commitment criteria. There's a 5-point rating scale for each of these from high to low, and we have to maintain a medium score throughout the life of the project development, a medium score on both that project justification criteria and the financial commitment criteria. And so, so they monitor that pretty closely, and they provide an annual report to Congress that tells Congress what our project's ratings are and what their funding recommendations are for us. All right, so now we have a locally preferred alternative. We have our local funding source figured out, which is the recently passed income tax, and we have determined with FTA that we're eligible for the small starts program for federal funding. So now we're moving into the engineering and finally making the decisions about how we're actually going to construct and operate it. So instead of going, for forever and ever on about all the design, I thought I'd highlight some of the key decisions that we made on the red line and some of the things that are unique about our bus rapid transit system. So the decisions about how we were designed were intended really to emulate light rail and give the Red Line best chance possible at achieving some pretty ambitious objectives. So key among those is the running way. IndyGo made a decision at the start of the Red Line's design to prioritize transit to the maximum extent. So for most of the Red Line, we tried to dedicate lanes for transit use only. In some locations, we couldn't achieve dedicated lanes because the existing right-of-way and roadway widths would not allow it. And so the south half of the Red Line has a majority shared use lanes. But I'll talk about the north end next, where we have almost entirely dedicated lanes. So here on the south side, this is a picture of Virginia Avenue. You can see it's just a 2-lane road. We've got curbside stations. So there's one on the other side of the street that's identical to this one. This is before construction was complete, so it doesn't have some of the signage and stuff at the station. But in this case, the bus is running in the street with traffic. When it stops at the station, traffic does queue up behind it. North of our downtown transit center, we were able, as I mentioned, to construct almost all dedicated lanes. So during the planning, we really determined that we wanted fixed guideway BRT, that it would achieve more of our objectives than a more corridor-based BRT, provide more efficient service because it allows us to keep our headways more consistent, provides reliable travel time for our riders, and it reduces some of the turning and driveway conflicts that can come when we're sharing lanes with cars. So the more dedicated lanes we can include, the higher our system is for speed and reliability, which then in turn brings about higher ridership. Fixed guideway can attract higher levels of ridership than you might predict based on the service characteristics alone. So on Capitol, where we start our dedicated lanes, this is a picture of Capitol Avenue, and Capitol Avenue is a one-way southbound street, or was until we came in with our BRTs. So it had about 5 lanes of southbound traffic. We took the easternmost lane, so this picture is looking south. We took the easternmost lane and made it a northbound bus-only lane. It was in the lane that used to be parking. And then the southbound lane, which is on the other side of the station, is the easternmost southbound traffic lane, if that makes any sense. So on this segment, on Capitol Avenue segment of the route, the bus lanes are painted in solid red markings, as you can see here, and we have skip marks in the southbound lane. The skip marks at certain locations in the southbound lane, those skip marks indicate where general purpose traffic is permitted to turn left from the lane. On Meridian Street, the BRT runs in the middle 2 lanes of what was a 4-lane roadway. We constructed a concrete median to prevent vehicles from turning left or crossing the BRT lanes. It's one of the kind of safety concerns, especially with a very quiet electric vehicle, was worries about cars crossing those bus lanes without protection. So we allow left turns only at signals when we're operating in the center lanes. The signals also facilitate pedestrian crossings, and we do permit U-turns at all of the signals as well, which didn't used to be allowed on Meridian Street. In this location, because it was such a long stretch, we did not do solid red bus lane markings along all of Meridian Street. Instead, we used the red lines that you can see on the outside edges to mark and separate the general purpose lanes from the bus only lanes. And then perhaps our most unique here is on College Avenue, where we have a single bi-directional lane that is controlled through signals and driver communication. So BRT vehicles pass each other at the station areas in this version. And the bi-directional lane was selected for several reasons. One was community feedback and concern about losing on-street parking. This stretch has large sections of residential land use, and on-street parking was really seen as critical for residents and the small businesses along this segment. So we were able to make it work only because it was a 5-lane road, only by bringing the stations and everything into a single bidirectional lane. This is a rendering of our stations. Stations are unique on bus rapid transit systems and are set up so that to help facilitate the BRT working like a light rail. So they have, if you were on a light rail platform, some very similar features. For instance, we have off-board fare collection at all of our stations where riders purchase tickets before they get on the bus. It speeds things along so they're not lining up to pay once they get on the bus. We have level boarding, so the BRT buses dock at the same platform height as the stations. It allows just a super easy transfer for passengers, especially those with strollers or wheelchairs or those traveling with bicycles. We have transit signal prioritization. We have real-time information, and then the stations are spaced no closer than a quarter mile apart, and usually more like half a mile or further apart, which it adds again to the speed of the system. So construction of the Red Line took about a year and a half. During the final 9 months of the project, which was nearly all of 2019, we worked under an acceleration agreement with as many as 25 or 30 crews working at any one time. They frequently worked overnight doing concrete pours during the overnight hours in order to avoid traffic impacts, worked many Saturdays. And it was largely, well, there were many reasons that we decided to accelerate, but largely was so that we could open in September instead of in the middle of winter, and just have a easier time of training our drivers and providing passengers with an easier time to get started on a new system. We had 2 contractors. One was responsible for all the civil work, which was the pavement, drainage, sidewalks, curb ramps, and the other was responsible for all the stations and communications work. And although this was a transit project first and foremost, it was also a really significant public works project. We had tens of thousands of linear feet of storm sewer, curbs, sidewalk replacement, and almost the entire length of the project was resurfaced. There are several things, and I think in the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of detail because I want to leave time for you guys to do Q&A. But we did have some, challenges during construction that we can certainly talk about if there's any interest. We had a lot of utility conflicts that we had to work around, and so we made changes kind of on the fly so that we could reduce the schedule implications of those. Utility relocations had to happen before we could construct, and we spent a lot of time coordinating with the utilities to get them out of the way where we needed them out of the way. We had some stakeholder opposition, and so we put some special measures in place to try to communicate better, share information, and reduce kind of impacts to businesses along the line and residents along the line. And then one of the things that we did maybe a little later in the process than we would have liked to was put together an operating and maintenance agreement with DPW for who would be responsible for different parts of the project after it was constructed and open. So we opened September 1st, 2019. We are the nation's first all-electric BRT system once we get it all built. We use 60-foot battery electric articulated vehicles. They're made by BYD. And I already mentioned it's a 13-mile corridor. We did have some lessons learned in implementation. We would have when we do the purple line, we will leave more time for driver training. We really crunched it down on the red line because of that acceleration. We found that managing a 10-minute headway, which we spent a lot of time telling the public, oh, the bus will come every 10 minutes. Managing that was really hard, especially with some inconsistent docking speeds. So the drivers are driving at different speeds and able to dock some more easily than others. We had some challenges with configuring and testing our real-time systems, and we had so many people. The first probably month or 2 months, we were so crowded. You could stand on a platform and have 3 buses go by and not a it was a COVID nightmare when I look back on it, but not even a space to crowd in and get in there. So this is, I think, my last slide. This is us today. We've got 212 buses. We've grown from about back in the days of our service cuts where we had maybe about 400 employees. We're at about 800 now. We've got 1 million fixed route riders a year. We've got 1 line open, 2 BRT lines coming up. We are recovering from the pandemic and we're looking forward to a bright future. So I will stop sharing and give you guys a chance to ask questions. You only have till like 4:20, is that right? Oh, am I frozen?
Yes, that is correct. Well, thank you for that presentation. That was great. Kind of sees the back end of how the BRTs are created. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I see Abdullah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
That 80% FTA gave capital and the other 20% came from the new taxation, that 0.25% of the income tax. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so this one's a little interesting because when we were going out for the referendum, there was a lot of controversy about the red line, and we had already gotten pretty far into the design. So we actually came up with our local match using $0 from the referendum money. So that local referendum will be paying for the local match on blue and purple line. But for the red line, our 20% local match came from other sources. So we had some other federal grants. We had some from congestion mitigation and air quality. I think we had some Tiger grant money in there. The city of Indianapolis contributed some, and then we just had some capital reserves.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
That answers, yep.
What percent of the total commuting trips by transit? Generally people think in the country that Indianapolis is really automobile city, and transit is minor. So it's very good that you're doing, you people are doing things, because there is a latent demand. I always felt that a lot of people wanted to use if it is available, because one time when I don't know how long ago, the freeway, they decided to close it entirely, and they provided from the downtown to outlying areas, you can park and free travel. And people loved it. They wanted to pay for it and wanted to continue. But okay, good. I will let other people ask questions.
Okay.
Very nice, very nice.
Go ahead, Abdul.
So I'll go ahead and ask my question. A question probably related a little bit to one more question that came in the chat box, and I was going to ask about dedicated lanes versus shared lanes. Was the decision only based on right-of-way, or were there other factors that played a role in making those calls?
Yeah, so many factors. So certainly right-of-way. We went into the design of the red line trying to minimize any right-of-way impacts. So we wanted to keep it as much as we could within the existing curbs. Did not want to deal with eminent domain and all of that. We did end up we kind of set slivers of right-of-way. So in certain areas, we'd have a couple feet of right-of-way here and there. Most of that was in order to get left turn lanes in at station areas, because it kind of bulbs out at the station areas. So right-of-way was one aspect, but really in large part, it was about really trying to emulate the light rail. So if you imagine, the bus on the south end of the line where it's behind cars at lights and it's part of all of the traffic congestion around it, versus on the north end of the line where we've got a lane all to ourselves and we can zip forward to the next light. We're able to keep that reliable every 10-minute service because we're not subject to the changes in traffic congestion like peak hour versus non-peak hour and stuff. So it's about reliability, speed, service, and it provides, so as Dr. Sinha was saying, right, we have a lot of people who ride our transit system because that is their only choice. They can't afford to own a car, or maybe they have a disability that doesn't allow them to drive a car. But in order to grow our system, we really need to bring in riders who choose to ride transit. And having those dedicated lanes, that service, that reliability is really kind of that next step to bringing people who choose to abandon their cars and take transit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think we have Dr. Fricker next, and then I'll read the two from the chat.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hey.
A quantitative and a qualitative question.
Okay.
These buses are from BYD, that's a Chinese make.
Correct.
Did you consider any other buses?
Yeah, they did. So it's been, I could talk for another, hour and a half, probably, just about our buses. We've had some significant challenges with our buses. We looked at New Flyer, BYD, Gillig. I'm trying to think if there was another, Proterra. This one at the time, and actually still is, although it's not achieving our objectives for mileage per charge, it's still a lot stronger than the other electric buses. We were also constrained by the fact that we were operating in the middle of the road, and so we needed buses with left side doors. So that limited our choices. And we had committed to electric. So we needed to find a 60-foot electric bus with left side doors that had the best battery range that we could. So I wasn't at IndyGo at the time, so I can't recall if they had a competitive bid for the buses or not, but that's how we ended up with BYD.
That's a very thorough answer. What was the price tag eventually per bus?
Per bus, I want to say it was like 1.2 million. Mm-hmm. And if you'd like, I can get you the exact number.
Well, that's fine. Thank you.
But somewhere in that range, under 1.5.
Alrighty. Okay, I'm going to read one from the chat.
Okay.
Okay, it's a two-part question. It says, how did COVID-19 affect this process and the continuing implementation process of the other lines? And then the second question is, on the southerner part, how was the BRT affected by the fact that it was sharing the lane with other vehicles? So you kind of already touched on this. And did it decrease the efficiency of the service?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I did cover that one. On the COVID end of things, it really hasn't slowed us down in our planning and design. We feel pretty confident that our ridership is going to come back. There is, and that's based upon kind of the national view of where we're at, and who knows? we're all trying to make predictions for the future, but our Federal Transit Administration funding is still secure. We did have to make some changes and some considerations. Sorry, we've got emergency vehicle behind me. We did have to make some changes and considerations, a lot of discussion about our ridership projections, which goes then into our ratings for FTA. So the number of riders that we have is part of that whole rating and scoring. So that was kind of a big discussion point with FTA, but in the end, it has not slowed us down in our development of the projects. Was there any other parts of that I didn't answer? Second.
No, I think you addressed
Okay.
all of it.
Okay.
I have one more from the chat, and then I see two people have raised their hands. So let me see. Okay. The question is, were equity issues considered in the city's transit planning activities? For example, the interests of low income, the elderly, the handicapped, etc.
Yes, absolutely. So in our alternatives analysis, when we were identifying what streets the BRT would run on and where the stations would be, we had a number of equity measures that we evaluated the alignments against. And so I think I had the diagram of the number of households below the poverty level that was in there. We also had socioeconomic minority populations. We had percentage of households with zero cars. And then we looked at those measures both from a positive and a negative standpoint, because we wanted to achieve the highest level of access for minority and or disadvantaged populations, but we also didn't want to impact those populations negatively. So we looked at it both ways.
Okay. And then our next question is from Margaret. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Jennifer. So I remember hearing that, I guess with the battery problems with the BRT buses, I was wondering how you guys were able to like work with that problem.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting one, and there are a combination of factors there. So one of the factors I will just admit was that we had some lessons to learn. So the folks that put together the agreement with BYD promised us 275 miles per charge. And, you know, we'd never done this before. And the people that at that time made decisions about how many buses to buy were probably a little aggressive in their understanding of what that mileage requirement meant. So on a perfect day, when it's probably 60 degrees and sunny and the drivers are driving it just perfectly, we can probably achieve that 275 miles. But when it gets cold and we have to turn on our heaters and or drivers being especially aggressive with the braking, or, you know, a number of factors, we can get down to like I think our average is probably 180 miles per charge. So you can imagine that having that variability causes some problems, because it makes it hard for us to determine how many buses need to be out on the street, how long each bus can go, so the scheduling and everything. And so we've modified our operations over the past year to get to an average. I think maybe they assume, like in this kind of weather today, I want to say they assume maybe we'll get 200 miles a charge. The other thing that we've done is work with BYD to install in-route charging. So BYD is constructing in-ground charging for us at the north end of the line and the south end of the line. One of them is under construction now, should be operational by the end of April. The other one is in design now, should be operational by June. And what we'll do there is the bus will stop and charge for 10 minutes, just kind of top itself off at the end of pretty much every run.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. We do have a minute, so I'm going to squeeze in a question really quick.
Okay.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about the how you quantify the job accessibility portion? Was it actual places of work, or did you look at how many occupations were available within each place of work? How detailed did you get with that?
We did both. So we had one measure where we looked at like the number of major employers. So if we hit Ivy Tech and, you know, if we hit like 6 very large employers, that was one measure, as compared to, oh, maybe we come within a half a mile of one. And then the other one was using census data. I can't remember where the employment data comes from, but somewhere in the census data, it was 7 or 8 years ago. Somewhere in the census data, we were able to identify employment density, so the number of jobs per square mile in the census tracts. And we did basically a GIS analysis of that information.
All right, thank you. I don't regret taking up the extra minute. Thank you all for attending the seminar. We'll see you again next week. Jennifer, thank you very much.
Yep, great to hear from all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye, Nadia.
Yeah, wonderful, Jennifer.
Thank
Nice
you,
seeing
Clarence. You too. Ariana, if there's anybody that has any follow-up questions, if it tweaks them, and I know your research may be relevant, but if anybody needs anything, I'm happy to answer questions. Feel free to share my info.
Okay, awesome.
Okay,
Will do.
bye guys. Thanks for inviting me.
you.
See ya.
See ya.